In a very, very recent recording, which you may or may not have seen, to be fair, but in a very recent tutorial, I asked the question, if this is you playing badminton, about to jump on your bike, you're lifting weights in the gym or on the treadmill, whatever, you're whacking a ball in cricket, baseball, rounder, softball, whatever. This one baseball, of course. If that happens, if you're doing that, what happens to, let's call it, your tidal volume, technical term for breathing depth? If this is the case, if you start exercising, what happens to your breathing depth, tidal volume? Well, I think you would tell me, well, James, it goes up, doesn't it? And when I'm about to go into rest and recovery, it will drop back down again. Now, we have talked about this previously, and we have said this is controlled if we ask that question, by the way, of how does that happen, we have said previously that we had this example of the brain sort of communicating with the heart, and if it was heart rate, that would be the answer. The vagus nerve would decrease heart rate parasympathetically. The accelerator or the cardiac nerve would sympathetically increase heart rate. And we looked at that kind of neural way that happens. But this tutorial is not about heart rate. This tutorial is about the role of breathing muscles. Now, I've just sort of summarized a bunch of breathing muscles here, the diaphragm, the intercostals, which there's two groups of, sternocleidomastoid, pectorals, abdominals, so just rounded names in this sense. But how can it be that in order to cause tidal volume to increase or decrease in recovery, these muscles have to contract with more force or even more muscles involved? And they also later on will recruit muscles to increase the rate of actually breathing out and therefore the rate of breathing as a whole. How does that actually happen? And the answer to that is, once again, we do it neurally. It's a neural control. Okay, so we have a series of neural factors, which means these muscles, for example, and I'll go into specifics of that a bit later on in the tutorial, can control, for example, harder. Well, how does that happen? Well, first of all, we have movement. Now, remember that when you start moving, we've got rounders, we've got badminton, we've got baseball, we've got cycling, we've got weightlifting here. When this happens, you have a series of mechanoreceptors in your muscles and in your tendons. You actually remember that they're called muscle spindles. Those are the ones in the muscle. They're muscle fibers surrounded by sensory tissue. We also have GTOs, or Golgi tendon organs, in the actual tendons themselves. They're called mechanoreceptors, and they can sense change in pressure in the movement. For example, let's say when this fella jumps on his bike, the rectus femoris, for example, starts to contract as the pedals are pushed downwards. And of course, what's going to happen there is those mechanoreceptors are going to feed that back to the brain. And here, our brain is able to produce a breathing response. Now, this is where I want to introduce you to something called the Respiratory Control Center, the RCC. But I also want to introduce you to its two sub-departments, if I can use that phrase. We have what's called the ICC. This is called the Inspiratory Control Center. And we also have the ECC, the Expiratory Control Center, the breathing in control center, the breathing out control center. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a bit of detail, but the point I want to make is that in the medulla oblongata of the brain, just there, this respiratory control center with its inspiratory and expiratory parts to it are taking neural information, for example, from the mechanoreceptors to either increase or decrease tidal volume, and you'll see later on also to increase or decrease breathing rate. Now, neural factors movement is one, but it's not the only story at play here. We can also be thinking about, there's my pink arrow, we can also be thinking about blood chemistry. Now, this will not surprise you if you have seen my previous tutorial on cardiac control, but blood chemistry plays a role here, effectively a similar kind of relationship. But with blood chemistry, what we're looking for here is the fact that we have chemoreceptors. And these chemoreceptors, which of course are present in both the aorta, but also in the brain itself, they detect changes, and really emphasize that word changes, folks. They detect changes in blood chemistry. So for example, when we start exercising and our pH drops because our blood acidity goes up, our chemoreceptors will receive that information, or will detect that information. They will supply it to the respiratory control center. And then what can happen? Well, we can then get sympathetic stimulation of the diaphragm, say, to cause us to breathe in harder. That increases our tidal volume, our breathing depth. Fantastic. The opposite happens, of course, during recovery, and of course that's a potential change for us as well, and something that we can actually manage and support. But that's not the only two neural factors. We have a third. And again, if I just sort of loop down here, you will not be surprised to know that these relate not to blood chemistry, but to blood pressure. Because, as we've looked at previously, we also have our baroreceptors. Baroreceptors. By the way, I do all the writing and speaking simultaneously, so sometimes I mess things up. But anyway, we've got these baroreceptors. And what do? They detect changes, again, our key word, changes in blood pressure. So when we start exercising, let me just put that in, blood pressure. When we start exercising, of course, especially systolic, blood pressure increases. Why? Because the heart is filling with more blood, venous return, and therefore it contracts with more force, and that force creates a greater outgoing blood pressure. As a result of that, the baroreceptors detect that increase in blood pressure, and then we get sympathetic stimulation again of the diaphragm, say, or the external intercostal muscles, say, and we can increase the depth of breathing sympathetically. Exactly what we're talking about. However, I want to take this story a little further. We have got the brain, and within that brain, as you've seen, bad image of the brain obviously, we have got that respiratory control center. We also know that that respiratory control center has got two centers to it. It's got our inspiratory control, that's for breathing in. But as we're going to see in a second, it's also for breathing out. Now, I'll show you how this works. We've got our inspiratory control center. Just got a little lag there. Control center, apologies for that. And we also have our expiratory control center. Hard to say that when you're trying to go fast. Expiratory control center. Now, what is this all about? Why am I telling you this? Well, this is how it works. I'm going to tell you, first of all, about resting conditions. When we are at rest, the inspiratory control center, it will stimulate muscles such as the diaphragm, and let's say you go and have a look at these at the image above, and the external, I'll just put IC, intercostal muscles, the external intercostal muscles, it will stimulate them both to contract. Okay, so these two muscles are going to contract. Okay, now that is going to cause us to breathe in, hence inspiration. We're going to breathe in, right? However, this is where it gets interesting. At rest, when we are breathing out, you think I'm going to say to you the expiratory control center causes the no. At rest, it works like this. These muscles simply relax, and that causes us to breathe that out. Why? Because the sort of ribs fall back down, the thoracic cavity becomes smaller, it effectively bellows air out of our lungs. That continues. Now, what happens is, when we start exercising, this muscle and these muscles, they will contract a bit harder and a bit harder and a bit harder until they're at their maximum force. Once that's the case, additional muscles will get involved. We've got muscles like the scalenes. We've got muscles like the sternocleidomastoids, spelling above. We have got muscles like the pectoralis minor. These muscles now can increase the strength of that contraction. It is only when we are at very kind of maximal exercise that what will happen is that our expiratory control center will now kick in. And what this will do is it will stimulate the abdominals, obviously the rectus abdominis, really we're talking about here. It will stimulate the abdominals, and this muscle will pull down so we can breathe out faster. It also does this with our internal ICs, intercostals. Okay, it pulls the ribs down, and therefore we breathe faster outwards. So just notice we've got the respiratory control center, inspiratory control center, which controls both inspiration, breathing in, and expiration at rest and submaximal exercise. During maximal exercise, the expiratory control center kicks in and recruits expiratory muscles like the abdominals and the internal intercostals, which increase the rate. And this one here is all about the rate. So think about the ECC during maximal as increasing the speed of breathing, what we sometimes call F, or frequency.